What's up? Welcome to Saturday's Warrior. So on Friday, as everyone was gearing up for week one of college football, the ACC rudely interrupted by announcing that they were expanding by adding Stanford, Cal, and SMU. We suspected that this was coming, but we just wanted to enjoy football. Instead, we got more realignment news. And so, since I was just focused on watching games and enjoying the games this weekend, I'm just getting around to this video. I've had time to think about it a little bit and digest. I've heard a lot of things and saw a lot on Twitter of people criticizing this move, saying that it is going to be the death of the ACC, that it's dumb and this and that. And in many ways, I agree. I don't like the move. I don't like what's happening to the conferences, but we're going to take a look at why perhaps this is a good move for both the ACC and these schools. And then we're also going to take a quick look at the remaining Pac-2 schools and what their options are moving forward. But before we do, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really, truly does help a lot. And so without any further ado, let's get to it. So Stuart Mandel said it best. He said the ACC added Stanford, Cal, and SMU. It's a marriage of desperation that makes no sense in the real world and perfect sense in the warped world of realignment. So let's take a look at why exactly this makes sense after all we've seen, after all that's happened this year, this summer in realignment, why this deal does make sense for both sides. And so when looking at it, my newly updated map, we see that obviously this is looking at it through a lens of real world. This makes no sense geographically. It doesn't really make sense how this is even viable. It makes even less sense than the Big Ten. If you think about it, they at least have some schools in the middle of the country when they added those West Coast teams. And so this just looks like it's doomed from the start. But first, let's look at the perspective of Stanford and Cal. What is it that they're looking for? Yes, money would be nice, but they gave up a lot of money to do this. So what is it about? And it's really about not losing their seat at the table in a power conference. Big Ten didn't want them. SEC's not expanding to the West Coast. And I don't know if there was really ever any interest between the Big 12 and these schools. If from either side, I don't know. I hadn't heard anything, and it doesn't really seem like a fit. So not only is the ACC the last power conference standing that could possibly take them, but it also has a lot of like-minded institutions, or at least academically elite. You got your UNCs, UVAs, Dukes, other schools like that they can rub shoulders with. And so for them, they get to check the box. We're not getting left behind, even though they're not even putting a major focus, seemingly, on their revenue-generating sports like football or basketball. And this seemingly is going to hurt, or at least make things difficult on the sports and the athletics that they really do care about and prioritize in their Olympic sports and their non-revenue generating sports. So that is interesting, but they think that as long as they keep their seat at the table in a power conference, that's where they want to be, and that's where they feel like they deserve to be because of their brands. And from SMU's perspective, obviously same thing. They just want a seat at the table. This is kind of their last chance, it seems, at least in the meantime, to get into a power conference. And so they're doing whatever it takes to get in. But what about the ACC's perspective? What are they looking for? And we know that they want stability, that their top brands are saying they want to leave the conference, that they're not happy. And why is that? Because they're not making enough money. And it's to compete with other top programs in the Big Ten and the SEC, and they feel like they're getting left behind. And so, yes, the conference would like to bring in more revenue, and it will a little bit through this move, but that revenue is so little, it's not moving the needle. It's not really going to make a difference. And we know it's not. Well, one, because we know what the numbers are, but two, because Florida State, Clemson, and UNC still voted against this deal. And so why are they doing it then if they can't even convince the schools that want to leave to stay by making this deal. But one thing that I do respect about the ACC going ahead and moving forward with this addition is that we saw Texas and OU say, no, we really don't want to expand right now, after they interviewed what seemed like half the G5 schools out there. They decided, no, we're not going to expand. And then what happens? They go and they leave for the SEC. Same thing, USC, UCLA say, no, we don't really want to expand right now, when they had a chance to pick up Big 12 schools. And then what did they do? They turned around and went and joined the Big 10. So for the ACC, they already know that their top programs want to leave and that they're voting against this move. And the ACC, so I think, isn't really thinking about these programs. They're not doing it trying to sway the Florida States and Clemsons and UNCs to stay in the conference and continue building. What they're doing is thinking about their future. And if we look at this tweet from Brett McMurphy, he says that ESPN's media rights deal with ACC allows ESPN to renegotiate if league drops below 15 members. Aha, there it is. So it's probably not the full reason, but it's a contributing factor for sure that the ACC is looking at the writing on the wall and say, eventually Florida State and Clemson are going to find their way out of the conference, and probably UNC. And we don't know when it is, because each year it gets closer to the TV deal ending. It keeps getting cheaper and cheaper to get out. So every year that goes by, it's going to be easier and easier for them to get out of that deal. But they don't know when it's going to be. So to protect themselves, to keep their conference afloat, they need to add additional schools and avoid ESPN coming in, renegotiating. Then they'd make even less in media revenue, fall even further behind. And so this is really about self-preservation at this point. And what other options do they have? We found out also in the piece by Ross Dellinger that the ACC actually pursued Arizona State, and Utah along with Cal and Stanford. So they were looking at having a westward hub, which would have made more sense and brought in more kind of bigger brands along with Cal and Stanford. But we see that they found themselves behind a rival Power 5 conference, the Big 12, which had both geography and time on its side. So the ACC lost out on these schools to the Big 12. And just like Cal and Stanford didn't have another Power 4 at this point, Power 4 conference to join, the ACC had very few existing Power 4 schools left to pull from. And so in that sense, it was really just about, the last one standing, trying to position themselves to not get left behind. And you could say, well, the ACC could have looked to the AAC or any other G5 schools for some stability. But if we look at that, I would argue that their best bets, the best brands, the schools to go after would have been ECU, South Florida, Tulane, Memphis, all much closer, more in line with their existing geographic footprint. But the problem is with the ECU and USF is, they're probably too much in the geographic footprint. So the existing schools don't want to compete with them, add other schools in their footprint. Memphis, while geographically would be a great fit, and football's all right, basketball would be an excellent boost to an already strong basketball conference, but they're not there academically. We know that's important to the ACC, and they've been spurned before, so I think Memphis would be out. And then that really leaves you with Tulane, which sure is a great academic institution. They had a great year last year. We'll see if that's sustainable. But does Tulane, or even the combination of adding Tulane and SMU to your conference, really move the needle? I think they felt like no, and that is why they'd rather take Cal and Stanford at a reduced rate and bring them in, because they have that name brand with them. Now let's take a look at the last two standing, Washington State and Oregon State. And so what options do they have going forward, and what should they do? Now, we know that the American says that they're out, that they're not interested in going westward anymore. I guess those two remaining schools aren't big enough brands for them to, they feel, to make that trek cross country either. So I think it was kind of doomed from the start, unless maybe you had Stanford and Cal, and then I think the real appeal to them is that you're going in with some schools, at least, that were highly regarded academically: Rice, Tulane, SMU. And so now it just doesn't make sense. And when looking at the money, yes, the American is making a bit more, but the Mountain West deal is up in 2 years. And I would think at that point, because of inflation, that naturally their deal is going to go up and close that gap, if not surpass that $7 million with the American. And you'd think that if they added those two schools from the Pac, that the deal would be boosted even more. So it just didn't really make sense to me why the American would really fit for them. But wait, there is hope. And I had heard that the Pac-12 still was owed money, and that all the schools leaving are basically forfeiting the right to that money as long as the conference exists. So if Oregon State and Washington State can keep it together, they would get all that money. But I didn't realize just how much it was. If we look at this, it says $90 million in NCAA men's basketball tournament units over the next 6 years, about $80 million in college football playoff revenue for the last 2 years of the current contract, and about $80 million for the last 2 years of ESPN's deal with the Rose Bowl. And that is a lot of reasons to want to keep the conference together. And that's not even to mention the status as an A5 conference, which there's no guarantee that they would be able to keep that going forward, but at least in the short term, they would have that with a chance to keep it going. And then obviously the Pac-12 brand is worth something. And so you're not giving that up either and simply just folding and walking away. So there's a lot of reasons for them to try to keep this thing rolling. And I imagine they are going to explore every opportunity they can to try to do so. There's something else in their favor. The NCAA bylaws require a conference to have at least 8 members, but there is a 2-year grace period. So this gives them 2 years to try to build the Pac-12 back up. And then I would think, even worst case scenario, let's say they can't do it after 2 years. That's still 2 years of them collecting big chunks of that money that we just reviewed that they can take. And then if they have to settle for, the demotion to a G5 conference, they could do that then. But also remember that the Mountain West, that their current TV contract expires in 2 years. So that is aligned perfectly. And that would give them the opportunity that instead of being absorbed by the Mountain West, to do a reverse merger where they take in the Mountain West. And so they could either handpick whichever schools they want from the Pac-12 at that, or the Mountain West at that point, because they won't have to pay a buyout. They could absorb all the schools or the entire conference and then just take what assets they want from that. I don't know all the legal options and everything, how that would work behind that, but at the very least they could go and get schools without having to pay that buyout in 2 years. The trick is they'll have to find a way to hold it together until then, and we'll get to that. So not only does this make so much more sense geographically when you look at these schools, but now they don't have to think about being demoted to the Mountain West. They get to keep the Pac-12 brand and bring these schools in to join them, whether it's some or all of them. And you could even look at adding like Gonzaga for basketball and other sports, since Hawaii is football only, so to offset that. And you could even explore adding at that point a couple other schools from Texas, say a UTEP or a UTSA or any other programs if you felt like they brought value. But at this point, it really would give them options moving forward. So the question is, how are they going to fill out their schedules for the next 2 years? And even though they're technically in a conference and they'll have each other, that's still 8 or 9 schools that they need to schedule in that time, when most schools already have their schedules lined up. And BYU fans can attest to how difficult it is to have a schedule put together as an independent, even though. So the question is, how are these two going? So the question is, how are these two going to put? So the question is, how are these two going to put their schedules together over the next 2 years? BYU fans can attest to how difficult it is as life as an independent to get a quality schedule put together. And even though these two are technically going to be in a conference, not independents, they'll really only have one additional matchup from that. So that's still 8 or 9 schools that they have to schedule at a time when most schools are already scheduled out through those 2 seasons. So it's going to be difficult to cobble it together, especially later in the season once you get into conference play. But you would think that the Mountain West would want to come in and offer as many matchups and do what it would take to rearrange their schedules to facilitate games against these 2 schools, to continue to woo them and stay in their good graces, not knowing how things are going to play out between the Pac-12 potentially poaching Mountain West schools in 2 years, or a potential merger. So you'd think that they'll try to step in as much as possible. There's also a chance of, or the opportunity to just schedule more FCS opponents, but then that would make them not bowl eligible. And considering they would have a tie-in with the Rose Bowl, you'd think that that would be of interest to them to be bowl eligible and have schedules in which they could go represent the conference in the Rose Bowl, assuming that that is going to be going away in the future. So they do have their work cut out for them. With all the realignment changes, you know, that like Utah and BYU will now be in conference. So that matchup would open up earlier in September to likely being at the end of the season. So both of them could have an out-of-conference game that they need to schedule. Would they want to schedule someone of the likes of Oregon State and Washington State versus an easier school? Maybe, but that is an option, and they might just have to pay a lot of money to get those games. I don't know, but it will be difficult, but I still think that this would be the better option just because of just how much is on the line by staying in the conference. So that's just what I think. What do you think about the additions to the ACC? Does this move make more sense now looking at their motivations, or do you still think that this is a bad move? And if you do, what should they have done? Let us know in the comments. Also, what do you think Oregon State and Washington State should do? Should they try to preserve the Pac-12? Should they just go to the Mountain West? Something else? Go independent? Let us know that in the comments as well. And as always, please don't forget to like the video and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Go Cougs!